He's a pillar of community opinion.
The Rob Snow Show returns
On Rogers TV and City News.
101.1 FM
And 1310 AM.
So as Sarah just mentioned, Prime Minister Trudeau, Premier Ford will attend a vigil tonight in London, Ontario for 5 members of a Muslim family. Police say they were the victims of a deliberate attack. The vigil is going to be outside the London Muslim Mosque this evening. Premier Ford says the attack has left the province in mourning. 4 people died, 9-year-old boy in hospital. And as a result, Premier Ford has said all government events are canceled today, and they're going to allow the family and the community to grieve. We brought you some of the speeches by the federal political leaders in the previous hour from the House of Commons here on the Rob Snow Show. But let's get a little bit more into the actual on-the-grounds investigation and what would be involved in something like this. Phil Gurski is here. He's president and CEO, Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting. Good morning.
Morning, Rob. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Well, been better, I suppose.
Yes.
I'm a native of London, Ontario.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, I'm born and raised, so it kind of hits home.
Wow. I didn't know that about you, Mr. Gurski.
Yeah.
So, that does hit close to homes. Boy, it's amazing that something like that could happen in London, Ontario. Ontario had 4 murders for the entire year last year, it said. No,
you're right. But, I want to remind your listeners that when I worked at CSIS, from 2001 to 2015, we dealt with a serious terrorist attack that took place in Algeria, of all places, that was carried out in part by 3 Londoners, 3 high school students who actually had converted to Islam, become Islamist extremists, and went to Algeria and killed 41 people. So,
wow.
Yeah, London is not normally known for that. I agree with that. It was a safe town when I was growing up there.
Right.
And it's a disheartening, horrific, cowardly crime that was committed. And I think it strikes all of us as, what a wanton, unnecessary waste of life by this young man for reasons yet to be determined, I suppose.
Yeah. So suspected hate crime, London police say terrorism charges might be laid. Do you think this would rise to the level of a terror attack? Federal politicians use the term, it was an act of terrorism, a terrorist attack today. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I heard the Prime Minister just say that, and my first question is, what does he know that I don't know and that you don't know? Because not a lot of information has been made public. No, fair enough, Rob. He's the Prime Minister. He might have access to intelligence that I no longer have access to. But all we know is that it was deliberate. London police have said it was premeditated, which suggests first-degree murder. They've suggested he targeted them because they're Muslim, which suggests a hate crime. Does not suggest terrorism at this point, because a hate crime is not a terrorist crime necessarily. The two are not the same thing. They're not synonymous. And, for terrorism charges to be laid by the Crown, there has to be a really strong link between a political, ideological, or religious motivation. And I'm sorry, we just don't know that just yet. So I think people are conflating hate with terrorism. They're not the same. It may turn out to be that way. But I don't know, again, unless there's information that they have that I don't have, I can't get there just yet. And if it's determined that he did this because he subscribed to right-wing extremist websites and he was a member, I got no problems with terrorism. I'm just saying that as of noon on, June the 8th, we don't know that just yet.
Okay. This is what the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons in the last hour or so. Phil Gurski, let's listen to this together here.
Assalamu alaikum. Lately, a lot of Canadians have been enjoying evening walks to get a bit of fresh air after long days at home during this pandemic. On Sunday in London, Ontario, that's what a grandmother, 2 parents, and 2 children went out to do. 3 generations of the Afzul family. Salman, Madia, their children Yumna and Fayaz, and their grandmother. But unlike every other night, that family never made it home. Their lives were taken in a brutal, cowardly, and brazen act of violence. This killing was no accident. This was a terrorist attack motivated by hatred in the heart of one of our communities.
Okay, so no accident. You heard him there, a terror attack. What would you like to know now, Phil Gurski, if you're law enforcement right now, or if you're part of the intelligence apparatus in the country?
Mm-hmm.
What are you trying to figure out right now?
What was in his mind when he did this? How long had he been thinking about it? London police suggest it was premeditated. You may have seen, Rob, that he was arrested with some kind of an armored vest, which suggests he was preparing for some kind of shootout, perhaps, with law enforcement, although he was arrested without incident, as far as I can tell. Again, when we're talking terrorism, it's a very specific thing under the criminal code. I mean, there are hate crime provisions under the Canadian criminal code. That's a separate section of the code. And judges have the authority and the leeway when talking about this. If you commit a crime and it turns out you committed it for hateful reasons, the judges can actually increase your sentence. That's what the criminal code says. But, unless the suspect comes out and definitively says, I did this because of X, Y, or Z, or they find something on his laptop or his iPhone or whatever, where he has said something online or posted something online, we can't make that leap just yet. The fact that this was a terrifying incident, and by all means it was, does not mean it was terrorism. I understand the emotional appeal behind this. I understand the desire to want to call it this.
Okay.
But as a guy that spent 32 years in intelligence, I need to see something more concrete.
Like what?
Well, again, did he belong to a group? Did he subscribe to an ideology? Did he post things online? Was he part of a network of people that believed this way? Did he follow certain people? Was he radicalized by somebody who had these views? That's what determines terrorism, not the fact that, it was a heinous act of violence that appeared to target an ethnic group. There's lots of hate crimes in this country, Rob. They're not necessarily acts of terrorism. They're cowardly acts of violence, but they're not necessarily acts of terrorism.
Okay.
So I hate to be dogmatic here, Rob.
No, that's fine. From an investigative point of view, you would think law enforcement now, they're in his apartment, they're going through all of his electronic devices, his correspondence there. They want to know his entire probably electronic history, right? Yeah.
And they're also probably contacting CSIS. I mean, CSIS is a body where, again, I spent 15 years there that does counterterrorism investigations. Did he come across their radar in investigations? Did the RCMP know anything about him? The OPP has a very small anti-terrorism section. Again, I worked there in 2015. I retired from CSIS. Do they have anything? So they're going to want to cross all the T's, dot all the I's. The other thing, Rob, that your listeners should appreciate, if he's charged with terrorism and he's found guilty, there's no difference in the sentencing between that and first-degree murder. It's the same sentencing. If he's found guilty of murder and it's a hate crime, as I said earlier, then the judge has an actual a window to increase the sentence that is imposed on him. But for terrorism, he does not.
Yeah. The Prime Minister, as some of the opposition leaders pointed to, this is part of the reason why we classified groups like the Proud Boys as a terrorist organization. What do you think about that, labeling, say, the so-called far-right groups as terrorist organizations?
If the label warrants, I've got no problem with it. I was involved in the first listing of Al-Qaeda way back in 2002, believe it or not.
Okay.
But I also know, and I put this on my website, Rob, I know for a fact, and I've had this from very confirmed sources, that when the Proud Boys was suggested by the government as a terrorist organization, the security service pushed back and said, we don't have enough information to justify that listing. And yet it was listed anyway. So, listings is very much a political tool, I find. It does help in certain ways, in certain prosecutions, for instance, but let's not turn the listings regime into something that politicians are going to use for political purposes. And I think for the Proud Boys, that was a classic example. That was a knee-jerk reaction to the attack on the Capitol on January the 6th. I don't think they're a terrorist group. I think they're probably
in Washington. I mean,
group.
in Washington.
Yeah. I think they're probably a far right group.
Yeah.
Are they a terrorist group? Well, if someone can point to an actual act of terrorism they carried out, I'd love to see it because I haven't seen it yet. I'm not dismissing them. They're not a bunch of guys that want to be my neighbors. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah. You're not inviting them over for a barbecue and some beers,
I'm not.
right? Yeah.
But I'm not saying they're a terrorist group. Are they a hate group? Maybe. Are they a far right group? Probably. Again, I'm not trying to mince words here, but I mean, it's important that we do this properly.
Yeah.
And let me throw something else, Rob.
Yeah.
If they lay terrorism charges and they can't prove beyond reasonable doubt that it was an act of terrorism versus first-degree murder, does the case fall apart?
Right.
Do they lose the case?
Right.
Again, so if you're the Crown, you want to win, right? You don't go to court to lose.
Yeah.
So the Crown's going to say, what is the best option we have here. Alexandre Bissonnette in Quebec City was not charged with terrorism. He was found guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder. Alec Benassian was not charged with terrorism. The guy out in Edmonton back in 2017 who hit the cop outside of Commonwealth Stadium, had the ISIS flag on the dashboard. He was not charged with terrorism. He got 29 years for 5 counts of attempted murder. So I get again, as I said before, I get the emotional appeal of wanting to call it terrorism.
Okay.
But from a purely prosecution perspective, you don't necessarily have to go down that road to get the exact same result.
Okay. Very interesting. Phil Gurski, thank you so much. It's always so great to get your insight on these matters. Thank you again.